On the 8th of July, 1914, in the gardens of Marble House, Newport, Rhode Island, the air smelled faintly of salt and crushed boxwood. On the terrace, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont checks a tea table, laid with custom votes for women porcelain, ordered in suffrage colors for the conference of great women she has convened that summer. Photographs from the day show banners of purple, white, and gold hanging from the balustrade. Marble House turned into a stage for politics as much as hospitality. Behind her, the clipped lawns and parterres that once signaled private opulence now frame a public argument about power. As footmen bring in fresh flowers from the garden, she adjusts a small arrangement on the tea table, a gesture of practiced grace, but also of control over who will sit here, who will speak, who will be seen. By evening, the papers will praise the spectacle. The gardens, as always, will be silent on what it costs to keep them perfect and what it will mean one day to let them go. By the summer of 1907 in Newport, Rhode Island, the gardens at the Elms, summer residence of coal magnate Edward Julius Berwind and his wife Sarah, were nearly complete. The limestone house, modeled on the Château d'Asnières outside Paris, sits at the head of 11 acres of formal gardens, developed between 1902 and 1914 under architect Oris Trumbauer's direction. The scale alone announces ambition. Terraces descend in measured stages, each level offering new vistas of clipped hedges, marble fountains, and geometric beds planted with thousands of annuals replaced seasonally. A landscape report from the Cultural Landscape Foundation describes a grand allée stretching from the house toward Bellevue Avenue, marble pavilions positioned at strategic viewpoints, and a sunken garden aligned with fountains and classical sculpture, a deliberate echo of 18th century French palace grounds, particularly Versailles and the Tuileries. The reference is intentional. Berwind, who made his fortune in Pennsylvania coal mines, understood that European aristocratic forms legitimized American industrial wealth. The garden was not merely beautiful, it was an argument about belonging. A color postcard from the period captioned Tea House and Garden, residence of E. J. Berwind, Newport, R.I., freezes the scene. Clipped hedges forming walls of green, bright flower beds arranged in patterns visible from upper windows, stone balustrades framing distant glimpses of the ocean. The image circulates among society families, a template for aspiration. What the postcard cannot show is the labor required to maintain this appearance. Somewhere behind the scenes, gardeners move in near silence. Later accounts recall a 40-person household staff serving the Berwinds' short but intense summer season, mid-June through early September, with the garden labor folded into an invisible army of service. Head gardeners coordinated teams that worked from dawn, deadheading spent blooms, raking gravel smooth, ensuring that no leaf marred the perfection of the reflecting pools. The work was continuous, exhausting, and essential. A single wilted border or an untrimmed hedge could suggest neglect, and neglect suggested financial trouble, or worse, declining standards. A niece, Julia Berwind, who will later inherit the house, learns early that one does not simply love flowers here. One arranges them as one arranges guests. During summer visits in her youth, she watches her Aunt Sarah consult with the head gardener each morning, walking the grounds with a notebook, marking which beds need refreshing, which urns require new plantings. Sarah Berwin's role is supervisory. She never touches soil herself, but her eye is exacting. A wrong color combination or a plant that grows beyond its assigned space is corrected immediately. The garden teaches Julia multiple lessons simultaneously. First, that beauty is constructed, not natural, requiring constant intervention and considerable expense. Second, that this construction must appear effortless, the machinery of its maintenance invisible to guests. Third, that one's relationship to beauty is not emotional, but managerial. One does not admire flowers, one deploys them. And finally, that failure to maintain such standards marks one as inadequate to one's position, unable to command the resources or the discipline required for this level of performance. On summer afternoons, when guests are invited for garden tours, Julia walks slightly behind her aunt, observing how Sarah gestures toward specific plantings, recites botanical names with casual expertise, and accepts compliments with the gracious modesty expected of a hostess. The performance is seamless. Only Julia, watching closely, notices the momentary tension when a fountain's timing is slightly off, or the quick glance toward a gardener when a border shows an unexpected gap. These micro-adjustments, invisible to guests, are the real work of maintaining the garden's social function. The garden is not just scenery. It is the first lesson in how beauty can be engineered and how much silence that engineering requires. The silence of the gardeners, whose names rarely appear in records. The silence of the cost, never discussed in polite company. The silence of the constant vigilance required to sustain the illusion of effortless perfection. For Julia and girls like her, growing up in such landscapes, this silence becomes second nature, as fundamental as the geometric patterns of the boxwood parterre. On an August afternoon in the 1880s at Wyncliffe, near Rhinebeck, New York, the lawns fall steeply toward the Hudson River, offering dramatic views that change with the time of day. Silver water in morning light, gold in late afternoon, deep gray as evening approaches. The Gothic pile, built in 1853 for Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones, is already notorious in New York society. Later generations will link it to the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, though the etymology remains disputed by scholars. What is certain is that Wyncliffe represented a particular kind of ambition, not merely to have wealth, but to display it through landscape on a scale that dominated the surrounding countryside. Edith Wharton, Elizabeth's niece, will remember the house in her autobiography as intolerably ugly, its Gothic revival style striking her as pretentious and overblown. Yet Wyncliffe's terraces and gardens appear in 19th century travel writings and society columns as part of a larger theater of display. Rolling lawns maintained by teams of groundskeepers, specimen trees imported from Europe and Asia, carefully framed river views that made the landscape itself seem like a series of paintings. The estate originally comprised 80 acres, though portions would be sold off as the family's fortunes declined. Historic American Buildings Survey images from the mid-20th century show the mansion already collapsing into ruin, walls open to the sky, porches sagging, and trees engulfing what had been formal paths and carriage drives. But in the 1880s, during its brief period of glory, Wyncliffe exemplified a particular Gilded Age aesthetic, the domestication of wilderness, the imposition of European order onto American landscape, the announcement through sheer acreage that one had arrived. For a young woman walking these paths, perhaps a daughter of the house or a visiting niece like Edith Wharton, the experience is meant to instill specific lessons. First, that scale matters. A small garden might be charming, but these sweeping lawns and distant vistas announced wealth in a different order entirely. Second, that landscape is legible. The careful arrangement of trees, the positioning of paths to create specific sightlines, the terracing that organized different levels of the garden into outdoor rooms. All of this could be read by those trained to do so, revealing the owner's taste, education, and resources. Third, and perhaps most importantly, that maintaining such a landscape required not just initial capital, but ongoing expenditure. The families who let their grounds decline, overgrown paths, untrimmed hedges, lawns gone to meadow, were announcing their reduced circumstances as clearly as if they had posted notices in the society pages. Landscape maintenance was not optional. It was a form of social communication, constantly refreshed, constantly monitored by one's peers. In the Gilded Age, however, a young woman walking these paths at Wyncliffe is meant to absorb these lessons without being told them explicitly. She is encouraged to admire the views, to comment on the beauty of a particular flower bed, or the cleverness of a garden ornament. But the real education is subtler. She is learning to see acreage, views, and ornamental plantings as a vocabulary of rank, as essential to social position as the correct use of calling cards or the proper execution of a curtsy. Her obligation is to move through these landscapes as if such scale were natural, as if everyone lived amid 60 or 80 acres of carefully managed beauty. The pressure is considerable. To express surprise at the scale would mark one as not accustomed to such environments. To fail to notice and comment appropriately on specific features, a new planting, a recently completed terrace, would suggest social blindness, an inability to read the landscape's messages. And to later fail to provide something comparable in one's own home would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that one could not maintain the standards of one's class. Long before the garden is allowed to die, and Wyncliffe's gardens will die spectacularly, reverting to forest as the house crumbles. It teaches her that admiration is not optional, and that failure to match such standards will be read on the landscape itself. The trees that will eventually consume the terraces are already growing in the surrounding woods, waiting. But in the 1880s, standing on a manicured lawn above the Hudson, such decline seems impossible, unthinkable. The garden feels permanent as the social order it represents. Around 1905 in Loretto, Pennsylvania, the estate of steel magnate Charles M. Schwab, Immergrün, named for the German word meaning evergreen, stands as another kind of garden lesson, different in character from the formal elegance of Newport or the Gothic grandeur of the Hudson Valley estates. Schwab, president of the newly formed United States Steel Corporation and one of the wealthiest men in America, built Immergrün as a country retreat, a place to escape Pittsburgh's industrial landscape. The estate sprawls across hundreds of acres of Pennsylvania farmland, combining working farms with ornamental grounds, practical agriculture with aesthetic display. Contemporary accounts report that Schwab's property employed around 100 gardeners and farmers, plus household servants, at a cost of roughly $100,000 annually, an extraordinary sum equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. These figures circulated widely in society pages, trade journals, and travel writing, functioning as proof of success, a numeric equivalent to marble fountains and imported trees. The numbers themselves became part of Schwab's reputation. Not merely that he was wealthy, but that he was wealthy enough to sustain a private ecosystem of employed workers, a feudal domain transplanted to early 20th century Pennsylvania. Garden manuals and society columns highlighted estates like Immergrün as examples of taste, publishing photographs of the greenhouses, the formal gardens, the orchards heavy with fruit. But these publications quietly reinforced that true refinement demanded not just land, but labor on a scale that only the very richest could sustain. To achieve the effects illustrated in these books, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the abundant borders, the lawns like green carpet, required not just knowledge, but infrastructure, teams of workers, extensive tool sheds and potting areas, heating systems for greenhouses, irrigation systems for gardens, and the managerial capacity to coordinate all of this labor. A visiting heiress, stepping from her carriage onto gravel warmed by the afternoon sun, feels the weight of the lawns stretching outward, acres of mown grass, each blade seemingly identical in height, the surface so perfect it might have been installed rather than grown. The house itself is vast, but not ostentatious, built in a style that suggests comfort rather than palace grandeur. But the grounds announce something different. This is a man who can afford to keep 100 people employed simply to maintain beauty, who can dedicate more workers to his gardens than many factories employed in their entirety. She watches as a maid carries in armfuls of roses from the cutting gardens, their stems wrapped in damp cloth, their colors carefully chosen to coordinate with the dining room's decoration. Later in the house, she will be taught to arrange these roses, how to cut the stems at an angle, how to strip thorns without damaging the bark, how to compose a centerpiece that looks abundant but not cluttered, natural but perfectly balanced. She will never be taught to grow the roses, to tend them through seasons, to manage the labor of the gardeners who produced this abundance. That knowledge is beneath her station. The unspoken expectation is clear. Someday, probably soon, she will preside over something comparable. Her future husband, whoever he may be, will be expected to provide grounds extensive enough to require staff, gardens beautiful enough to photograph for society magazines, landscapes that announce their position in the industrial aristocracy. She is here at Immergrün not merely as a guest, but as a student, observing how such an estate functions, how Mrs. Schwab manages her role as its mistress, how the performance of gracious hospitality conceals and depends upon the machinery of service. The gardeners themselves remain largely invisible during the visit. She might glimpse them in the distance, bent over beds or pushing wheelbarrows along service paths, hidden behind hedges. But they do not speak to her, and she does not acknowledge them beyond perhaps a vague wave if she encounters them too closely on a garden path. The social distance is absolute. They are part of the landscape, as much tools as the rakes and hoes they carry, and to treat them as individuals would be to violate the carefully maintained boundaries that make the whole system function. In these great gardens of coal, steel, and finance, the next generation of women learns that beauty is measured not in petals, but in payroll. A single perfect rose represents not just horticultural skill, but an entire economy of employment: the gardener who tended it, the workers who maintained the beds, the staff who cut and arranged the flowers, the system of greenhouses and heating and irrigation that made such abundance possible. To preside over such beauty is to command this economy, whether one acknowledges that command or not. By the 1890s and 1900s, advice books like Louise Shelton's Beautiful Gardens in America, 1915, and specialist journals targeted wealthy women, offering templates for terraces, pergolas, and color schemes. These publications presented gardens not as natural spaces, but as designed environments requiring expertise, investment, and ongoing management. A garden journal from the Chimneys estate in Manchester, Massachusetts, kept between 1903 and 1905, records the minutiae of seasonal work: sowing dates, pruning schedules, the arrival of new shrubs from nurseries, the replacement of plants that failed to thrive. Photography by Frances Benjamin Johnston documented gardens nationwide, turning private grounds into published models of status. Her images circulated in magazines and books, creating a visual vocabulary of what successful domestic landscapes should look like. The garden became a textbook. It taught what a lady's environment should look like, and, by implication, what her life should confirm. To live without such grounds, or to let them decline, was to announce one's exclusion from this world, one's failure to meet its standards. In 1903, at a Boston area estate like the Chimneys on Massachusetts' North Shore, the Garden Journal records with meticulous precision the rhythms of horticultural work. April 15th, beds turned, South Terrace. April 20th, roses move from winter storage. May verse, new shrubs arrive from Parsons. The entries are terse, factual, focused on tasks completed and materials acquired. What they do not record is the human labor behind each action: how many hours, how many workers, what decisions were made about where to place which plants. The Chimneys, a substantial summer estate belonging to the Lane family, overlooks the Atlantic from elevated grounds that drop in dramatic terraces toward the sea. Gardener Martin Lane, a Boston banker, and his wife Emma purchased the property in the late 19th century, gradually expanding both house and grounds. By 1903, when the Garden Journal began, the landscape was still evolving, still being shaped according to evolving visions of what such a place should look like. Olmsted Brothers, the landscape architecture firm founded by Frederick Law Olmsted's sons, will formalize the grounds a decade later. Their 1913 general plan includes water terraces that cascade down the slope, vegetable gardens tucked discreetly behind walls, and a rose garden positioned to catch morning light while offering views of the ocean. The design is carefully calibrated, formal enough to announce refinement, but not so rigidly geometric as to feel artificial. The goal is to make the landscape appear as though it naturally arranged itself into these beautiful forms, concealing the years of work required to achieve such apparently effortless grace. For the Lane daughters, the landscape is both playground and classroom. In early childhood, they run along the paths, hide among the hedges, and pick wildflowers from the meadow edges. But as they grow older, their relationship to the garden shifts. A governess walks them along the terraces, naming plants in French and Latin: Rosa rugosa, Iris germanica, Digitalis purpurea, correcting posture as they descend the stone steps. Stand straight, Catherine. You're not a farmhand trudging through mud. You're a young lady walking through her family's grounds. The rustle of their dresses, white lawn in summer, heavier wool in spring and fall, mixes with the sound of waves breaking on the rocks below and the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. The sensory experience is carefully curated, every detail contributing to a specific atmosphere of cultivated beauty and refined leisure. They learn that gardens have seasons, yes, but also moods, purposes, social functions. The rose garden is where one takes morning walks with guests. The vegetable garden, hidden behind brick walls, is not mentioned in polite conversation, though its produce appears at dinner. The journal's dry entries, beds turned, roses moved, silently encode the hours of gardener's labor and the expectations placed on young mistresses who will one day supervise such work. Supervision, they are taught, does not mean understanding the actual techniques of gardening. It means knowing what results to expect, recognizing when standards have slipped, and having the authority to demand corrections. A young woman is not expected to know how to prune a rosebush, but she must know when a rosebush has been improperly pruned. When the girls return indoors after their garden walks, they are sometimes asked to copy lists of flowers for the week's table arrangements, practicing penmanship while memorizing varieties. Roses, Madame Alfred Carrier, white, climbing, iris, English mixed, delphinium, Pacific giants blue. The lists serve multiple purposes. They teach botanical knowledge, they reinforce the connection between garden and interior decoration, and they prepare the girls for their future roles as managers of domestic beauty. One afternoon in June 1904, Catherine Lane, then 14, wrote in her diary, "Mother says I must learn to see when the borders need refreshing. I am to walk the garden each morning and note what wants attention. I confess I find it difficult. The flowers all look lovely to me. But Mother can spot a failing bloom from 20 paces. It is," she says, "a skill like any other, requiring practice and attention." The diary entry reveals both the seriousness with which garden management was approached and the training required to develop what was presented as natural taste. Before they are trusted with money or legal contracts, before they are introduced to potential suitors or brought out into society, they are trained to recognize the slightest flaw in a flower bed. Precision in beauty is rehearsal for precision in alliance. The same eye that can spot a misplaced plant will later assess a potential husband's prospects, evaluate a family's social position, and judge whether a particular marriage represents advancement or compromise. The garden trains them to see hierarchy, order, and the importance of maintaining standards even when no one is watching. By 1915 in Morristown, New Jersey, and across the American Northeast, Louise Shelton's Beautiful Gardens in America is in wide circulation, illustrated with nearly 200 photographs of significant gardens from Maine to Virginia. Its imagined reader is a woman with land, staff, and the means to remodel both, someone who might inherit an estate, marry into one, or persuade her husband to develop their country property into something worthy of publication. The book's examples, from Newport to Long Island, from the Hudson Valley to Philadelphia's Main Line, emphasize promenades designed as outdoor drawing rooms, vistas carefully orchestrated to impress guests at the moment of arrival, and gardens that function as extensions of the house, outdoor spaces for entertaining that mirror the formality of interior rooms. Each photograph is captioned with the garden's name and location, turning private spaces into public examples, objects of aspiration and potentially of envy. Shelton writes with authority but also with assumptions about her audience. She presumes they have gardeners, that the question is not whether to employ professional help but how to direct it. She discusses plant selection not in terms of difficulty, which plants are easiest for an amateur, but in terms of effect, which combinations create the most striking borders, which arrangements photograph well, which choices announce sophisticated taste. The technical work of gardening, propagation, soil amendment, pest control, is largely absent. This is a book about supervision and aesthetics, not about actual horticultural labor. In finishing schools and private lessons in New York, London, and Paris during this period, Daughters of wealthy families are simultaneously drilled in deportment, languages, and the conversational skills required to host in the kinds of settings Shelton's book illustrates. At Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, or similar institutions, the curriculum includes not just academic subjects, but the arts of gracious living, how to manage a household, how to organize entertainment, how to present oneself as mistress of an estate. During an afternoon lesson in deportment at one such school, a girl practices walking the length of a salon as if it were a garden path, balancing a book on her head to ensure perfect posture. The teacher watches critically. Your shoulders are not level, Miss Williams. If you cannot walk across a drawing room without swaying, how will you manage a receiving line? How will you descend a garden terrace in an evening gown without tripping? Every movement must be practiced until it becomes unconscious. Later, when weather permits, the students move into the school's own modest gardens, rehearsing greetings and exits, learning to offer a gloved hand at precisely the right moment, practicing the art of introducing guests to one another while walking along a path. As you turn the corner, Miss Henderson, you might say, "Mrs. Patterson, allow me to present Miss Clark, whose family has just arrived from Boston." Notice how the turn in the path provides a natural opportunity for the introduction. Garden design and social choreography work together. They learn to calibrate their compliments, effusive enough to seem genuine, but not so elaborate as to appear calculating. What a charming arrangement, rather than detailed botanical observations that might suggest unfeminine expertise. Your gardens are always so beautifully maintained, acknowledging the hostess's role while avoiding any direct reference to the gardeners whose labor made that maintenance possible. The garden has become a finishing school without walls. Every step, every glance, is part of an examination she did not choose but must pass. Failure is not marked by grades or formal censure, but by social consequences, invitations that cease, matches that never materialize, the slow recognition that one is not quite measuring up to standards whose exact contours remain deliberately vague. The vagueness is part of the control. If the rules were explicit, they could be mastered through study. By keeping them implicit, the system ensures that some will always fall short, that hierarchies will be maintained, that those who naturally understand will be distinguished from those who must be taught. In the 1920s at the Elms, now firmly under the management of Julia Berwind, after her sister-in-law Sarah's death in 1922, the gardens are maintained with a discipline that recalls the Edwardian era, increasingly out of step with the simplified lifestyles emerging after World War I. While other Newport families close their cottages, reduce staff, and simplify their entertaining, Julia continues as though nothing has changed, as though the world that created these gardens still exists intact. Accounts of the house in its final private decades emphasize that Julia maintained a staff of approximately 40 servants and continued to summer at the Elms until 1961, making her one of the last of the old guard to sustain such elaborate domestic arrangements. By the 1930s and 1940s, this adherence to Gilded Age protocols had become remarkable, even eccentric. Visitors describe arriving at the Elms and feeling they had stepped backward in time into a world where footmen still wore livery, where calling cards were still expected, where the gardens remained as meticulously maintained as they had been in 1910. Each morning, according to staff recollections collected after her death, Julia made a circuit of the grounds, inspecting beds and borders with the same critical eye her sister-in-law had employed decades earlier. She walked slowly, sometimes with a cane in later years, but her gaze was sharp. While gardeners knelt among the boxwood, she paused at the marble well in the sunken garden, checking that a vase of fresh flowers had been placed near the pavilion. One more small adjustment in a life measured by exacting standards of order and beauty. She is described as speaking little to the gardeners, offering corrections through the head gardener rather than directly. The hierarchy was maintained absolutely. She was Miss Berwind, they were staff, and the distance between these positions was not to be bridged by casual conversation or false familiarity. Yet those who worked for her report that she noticed everything, that no detail was too small to escape her attention, a single weed in a border, a hedge trimmed slightly unevenly, a path that needed fresh gravel, all were noted and corrected. Her letters from this period are sparse, formal, focused on practical matters rather than personal revelation. But the photographs, both professional images commissioned for preservation and casual snapshots taken by visitors, and staff recollections show a woman who clung to gilded age routines as the world shifted around her. The gardens were her stage, certainly, a place where she could still perform the role she had learned in youth, could still exercise authority and maintain the standards that defined her identity. But they were also her anchor, the one stable element in a world where so much else had changed, where women now voted, worked, traveled unchaperoned, where the elaborate social machinery of her youth had largely collapsed. By continuing to maintain the elms exactly as it had been maintained in 1910, Julia was making an argument, though she would never have phrased it so explicitly. She was insisting that standards mattered, that beauty required discipline, that the modern world's casualness represented not progress but decline. Or perhaps she was simply unable to imagine living any other way, having spent her entire life learning and then performing these rituals. To change would be to admit that the world she had been trained for no longer existed, that her skills and knowledge had become obsolete, as fortunes and fashions change around her, as Newport transforms from a bastion of old money to a more democratic summer resort. Her daily walk through the gardens becomes less a display and more an act of resistance against the encroaching possibility of loss. Each inspection of the borders, each small correction of a floral arrangement, each insistence that things be done properly, these are assertions that her world still exists, still matters, still deserves the care and attention it has always received. The gardens become both her domain and her refuge, the place where she can still control outcomes, where standards can still be maintained, where the chaos and uncertainty of the modern world can be held at bay through sheer force of will and continued expenditure. At Linwood Hall in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, by 1916, the Widener family's Italian-style ornamental grounds were being reimagined under the direction of French landscape architect Jacques Graber, with fountains designed by sculptor Henri-Léon Graber. The estate's 33 acres are being developed into what will become celebrated as some of America's finest formal gardens, rivaling anything in Newport or on Long Island's Gold Coast. The Widener fortune derives from multiple sources: streetcars, steel, tobacco, and astute investments across various industries. But it is Peter A. B. Widener's son George who commits most fully to the Linwood Hall project. George and his wife Eleanor have recently returned from extensive European travel, bringing back not just ideas but actual artifacts, statuary, fountains, architectural elements salvaged from French estates to incorporate into the Pennsylvania landscape. An early 20th century photograph from the Winterthur collection shows the result: a vast parterre laid out in geometric perfection, water basins reflecting sky and surrounding trees, axial paths drawing the eye back toward the house's limestone facade. The design is unabashedly formal, rejecting any pretense of naturalism in favor of pure architectural geometry. The message is clear: this is not a garden that evolved organically, but one imposed through will, capital, and expert design. Peter A. B. Widener's granddaughters, George's daughters, grow up in this environment, moving through these carefully orchestrated spaces as part of their daily life. The gardens are not merely background, but active participants in their education. They learn, without being explicitly taught, that space can be organized hierarchically, that nature can be bent to human will, that beauty requires not just resources, but the vision to deploy them correctly. A young woman, perhaps 16, dressed in pale lawn and carrying a lace parasol, walks the gravel paths with her governess on a June morning. The temperature is already warm, but the fountains provide the illusion of coolness, their splashing audible from throughout the lower gardens. She is reminded before each garden party or charity luncheon to see that the floral centerpieces match the garden outside: white lilies for one event, pink roses for another, yellow chrysanthemums in autumn. The coordination is not optional or merely aesthetic. It demonstrates that the house and grounds are unified, that everything is under control, that the family's management extends to the smallest detail. The act of arranging flowers at Linwood becomes part of a larger choreography that includes guest lists, menus, seating plans, and the careful balancing of old money, Philadelphia's established families, with new money, the industrial fortunes that are reshaping American society. A luncheon might bring together a Biddle or a Cadwallader alongside the wife of a steel magnate or railroad president. The mixing requires tact, careful management, and the kind of social confidence that these gardens are designed to project. But there are shadows here, even in the garden's prime. In 1912, George Widener, his wife Eleanor, and their son Harry perished aboard the Titanic, a tragedy that devastates the family. Peter A.B. Widener, who loses his son and grandson in a single night, continues to maintain Linwood until his own death in 1915. But the house's trajectory has changed. The gardens remain magnificent through the 1920s and into the 1930s, but the family that created them has been broken. Eleanor's daughter-in-law, also named Eleanor, inherits the house and tries to maintain it, but the scale defeats her. The cost of keeping staff, maintaining the grounds, heating the enormous house in winter, all of this becomes increasingly burdensome. The gardens require not just money but attention, daily supervision, the kind of focused management that assumes the estate is the center of one's life. As Eleanor's interests shift, as she spends more time in other residences, Linwood begins its slow decline. Geometry in the garden mirrors geometry in the guest list. Every path leads somewhere, and every seating choice has consequences. But the metaphor becomes darker when the paths begin to crumble, when the fountains run dry, when the geometric perfection dissolves into overgrowth. The same principles that created beauty and order can, in their absence, create ruin. A garden is not a static achievement but a continuous performance, requiring renewal, attention, and resources. When any of these elements fails, the entire structure begins to collapse. Across American magazines in the 1910s, articles on country seats and gardens of distinction proliferated, creating a national conversation about what successful domestic landscapes should look like. Publications like House Beautiful, Country Life in America, and The Garden magazine feature lavishly illustrated spreads showing estates from Maine to California, establishing templates that readers are invited to emulate, or at least to admire from a distance. A Smithsonian Institution exhibit on gardening to impress highlights how-to books and specialized journals aimed specifically at wealthy women, including the previously mentioned Garden Journal of the Chimneys, 1903-1905, as evidence of a culture that measured feminine success in significant part by the appearance and management of outdoor spaces. These publications did not merely describe gardens. They prescribed them, offering detailed instructions about how to achieve specific effects, which nurseries supplied the best specimens, and which landscape architects were most fashionable. Photographer Frances Benjamin Johnston emerges as a key figure in this cultural moment. Hired by wealthy families to document their estates, she travels from Newport to Florida, from the Hudson Valley to California, capturing pergolas draped with wisteria, tea houses positioned for optimal views, terraced lawns descending to rivers or oceans. Her photographs appear in books and magazines, turning private grounds into published models of status, transforming particular gardens into archetypes. What Johnston's images capture, and simultaneously conceal, is the dual nature of these spaces. In the photographs, gardens appear timeless, perfect, serene. The light is always beautiful, the shadows always artfully arranged. Lawns are uniformly green, borders are full but never crowded, and everything suggests effortless abundance. What the camera cannot show, or what Johnston carefully excludes, is the infrastructure of maintenance, the tool sheds, the compost heaps, the nursery areas where plants are prepared before being installed in visible locations. Neither can photography capture the temporal dimension. These gardens exist in time, requiring constant renewal. The border that looks so perfect in June will look ragged by August without deadheading, staking, and replacement of spent plants. The lawn that appears like carpet requires weekly mowing, rolling, aerating, and in many climates, significant irrigation. The stone terrace develops weeds between pavers, moss in shaded corners, cracks from frost heave. All of this must be continuously addressed to maintain the appearance of permanence. For the heiresses who inhabit these landscapes, the message conveyed by publications like Johnston's photographs is simultaneously inspiring and oppressive. The images show what is possible, what exists already in homes much like their own or homes they might someday manage, but they also establish standards that are unforgiving. To let a garden slip, to have brown patches on the lawn, untrimmed hedges, depleted borders, becomes more than horticultural failure. It is a sign of inattention, perhaps of financial trouble, certainly of declining standards. Society columns amplify this pressure by reporting on garden parties, describing in detail the settings in which they occur. A typical account from a 1912 Newport Society column reads, Mrs. Pembroke's Garden Party. Thursday afternoon was enhanced by the magnificent borders of delphiniums and roses, the beds having been entirely replanted this spring under the supervision of Olmsted brothers. The tea tables, arranged on the lower terrace, overlooked the ocean, and the whole effect was one of refined elegance. Such reports are ostensibly descriptive, but they function as evaluation, subtle rankings of whose gardens merit mention and whose do not. The very tools that celebrate gardens, books, photographs, postcards, society columns, will later bear witness when the same terraces crack and the same partners go to seed. The archives that preserve Johnston's photographs also contain images from later decades showing the same properties in decline. Wyncliffe collapsing into ruin, Linwood Hall's gardens overgrown, lesser-known estates sold and subdivided. The photographs that once announced achievement become evidence of loss, creating a visual record of both aspiration and failure. For women trained from childhood to read landscapes as texts announcing social position, the prospect of presiding over a declining garden carries profound psychological weight. It is not merely that the property looks less attractive, but that the deterioration announces to everyone who sees it, or who reads about it, or who sees photographs, that one has failed at the most fundamental task, maintaining the standards one inherited. The garden becomes both judge and evidence, silently testifying to inadequacy. On 8 July 1914, at Marble House in Newport, Alva Belmont deploys her house and gardens as instruments not of social exclusivity, but of political activism. The conference of great women she convenes that day draws hundreds of attendees, with banners in suffrage colors, purple for loyalty, white for purity, gold for hope, draped from the balconies and hung along the garden balustrades. Contemporary sources describe the event as a spectacular fusion of wealth and politics, using the very spaces and techniques that had been employed for decades to maintain social hierarchies now repurposed for feminist argument. Alva Vanderbilt, she has kept her famous first married name even after her 1896 remarriage to Oliver Belmont, and his death in 1908, understands better than most how to use space strategically. She pioneered the technique in 1883 with her legendary costume ball, forcing Caroline Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilts socially. Now, 3 decades later, she applies the same tactical intelligence to a different cause, women's suffrage. A contemporary account from the National American Woman Suffrage Association notes how she threw open Marble House, hung with the great purple, white, and gold banners, flooded with golden light, using beauty and prestige to give the suffrage movement prominence among the wealthy women whose support it needed. The gardens, the marble terraces, the ocean views all become part of the argument. The message is clear. Suffrage is not a radical fringe movement, but one embraced by America's social elite. The lawns and terraces that once displayed her husband's wealth, the marble imported from Europe, the gardens laid out by fashionable landscape architects, the scale that announced Vanderbilt supremacy, now frame speeches about women's rights, equality, and political power. Younger women observing, including her daughter Consuelo, the Duchess of Marlborough, who maintains an uneasy relationship with her domineering mother, see the day as potentially revolutionary. The spaces designed for one purpose can be adapted to another. A garden created to display private wealth can become a platform for public argument. Alva speaks from the terrace, her voice carrying across the assembled women. We have been told that our sphere is the home, that we are to be guardians of private virtue while men conduct public affairs. Very well, I've made my home, several of them, and I've presided over their gardens and their entertainments. Now, I choose to bring the skills I developed in that sphere into the public realm. If I can organize a ball for 1,000 people, I can organize a political campaign. If I can manage a household staff of 40, I can manage a movement. The tea service that day uses custom votes for women porcelain, ordered specially in the suffrage colors, each cup and saucer carrying a political message even as it fulfills a traditional social function. The juxtaposition is deliberate. The most conventional element of feminine hospitality, serving tea, is transformed into a vehicle for feminist politics. The women who attend can simultaneously participate in a familiar ritual and align themselves with a cause that challenges the very foundations of that ritual's social context. For younger women observing, including those still in their teens or early 20s, the conference offers a new model for what gardens and estates can be. They remain backdrops for alliances and reputations. Yes, but now the alliances are political as well as marital, and the reputations are built through activism as well as through marriage and motherhood. The traditional skills, organizing events, managing logistics, creating beautiful settings, orchestrating complex social interactions, can be deployed for purposes beyond maintaining one's family's social position. When a garden designed for exclusive display starts hosting public political arguments, its future as a private Eden is already in question. Alva may not have realized in 1914 that she was beginning a process that would ultimately transform not just her own estate, but the entire system of Gilded Age gardens. But by opening Marble House to hundreds of suffragists, by turning her private grounds into a semi-public space for political organizing, she was acknowledging, perhaps without fully recognizing it, that the old purposes were no longer sufficient, that something new was required. The gardens would never again be purely private, purely decorative, purely about maintaining social position. They had been politicized, and politics would not easily be banished. By the 1930s, the economic logic that supported elaborate estate gardens began to visibly fray. The stock market crash of 1929, the depression that followed, and changing tax structures all contribute to a new reality. Maintaining 11 acres of formal plantings, multiple fountains, and teams of gardeners becomes increasingly difficult to justify, even for families whose fortunes remain largely intact. At the Elms, Julia Berwin continues to run a full household into the 1950s, an increasingly anachronistic figure in a world that has moved on. Coal fortunes, which seemed inexhaustible in 1900, face new economic pressures: competition from oil and natural gas, mining disasters that generate expensive lawsuits, changing labor laws that increase costs, and taxation that reduces net profits. The Berwin family fortune remains substantial, but it is no longer expanding as it once did, and the cost of maintaining multiple estates — the family also owns homes in New York and Philadelphia — becomes harder to sustain. The gardens at the Elms require constant investment. Annual flowers must be purchased and planted twice yearly. Spring displays and summer displays, each requiring thousands of individual plants. Perennial borders need regular division and refreshing. Fountains require maintenance, their mechanisms requiring replacement parts that are increasingly difficult to source as the companies that made them go out of business. Stone terraces develop cracks that must be repaired. Trees grow old and must be removed and replaced. The bill for all of this, year after year, becomes harder to justify when the social world that the gardens were designed to impress has largely vanished. In Pennsylvania, the Widener family's wealth is tested by multiple blows. The 1912 Titanic disaster claims not just George D. Widener and his son Harry, but also the emotional center of the family's commitment to Linwood Hall. Peter A. B. Widener died in 1915, leaving a fortune estimated at $100 million, but divided among many heirs and tied up in complex trusts. The French gardens at Linwood Hall still appear in postcards and society photographs through the 1920s, but the number of people who can afford to maintain such grounds is shrinking rapidly. By the 1940s, Linwood Hall's gardens showed visible signs of neglect. Photographs from the period reveal gaps in the parterres where plants have died and not been replaced, fountains that no longer run, statuary that have developed cracks and stains. The family tries to maintain appearances, but the fundamental economics have shifted. The estate requires dozens of gardeners working full-time to look as it did in 1920. By 1945, they could afford perhaps 10 working part-time. The mathematical logic is inexorable. Insufficient labor means declining standards, which means further deterioration, which eventually means abandonment. For heiresses of this generation, women now in their 50s and 60s, who grew up in the garden's prime, marriage settlements and inheritance discussions increasingly include uncomfortable decisions about what land to sell, what gardens to retain, what staff to release. These are not merely financial decisions, but emotional ones, admissions that the world they were trained for no longer exists in sustainable form. To say, "We will close the West Terrace this season," is to acknowledge quietly that appearances can no longer be sustained in every direction. It is to admit defeat, to accept that the standards one was taught to maintain are no longer achievable. And because those standards were so thoroughly internalized, because women of this class were taught from childhood that the appearance of their grounds reflected their worth, the inability to maintain those grounds carries psychological weight far beyond the merely aesthetic. Some families attempt compromise, maintaining the gardens immediately visible from the house while letting more distant portions go to meadow or simple mown lawn. Others rotate maintenance, keeping different sections looking presentable in different years for specific events, then letting those sections decline while attention shifts elsewhere. But these strategies only delay the inevitable. A garden is a totalizing system. It cannot be partially maintained without the whole appearing neglected. The first sign a garden is dying is rarely dramatic, not a fallen statue or a collapsed terrace, but something much quieter, a canceled order for spring bulbs, a gardener who is not replaced when he retires or dies, a fountain that is turned off temporarily and never turned back on. These small decisions, made for what seem like practical reasons, accumulate into transformation. The garden that was perfect becomes merely good, then adequate, then shabby, then ruined, each stage seeming to arrive suddenly, though in fact resulting from years of incremental decline. In 1961, Julia Berwin died at the Elms at age 93, one of the last representatives of Gilded Age Newport, a woman who had continued to live as though the year were still 1910. The Berwin Corporation, which controls the family fortune, has no interest in maintaining the estate as a private residence. Within months, the house's contents were auctioned. Furniture, paintings, china, silver, linens, all the material accumulation of 6 decades of summer residence. Photographs from the auction show crowds moving through rooms that had been closed to all but invited guests for generations, the private made public through liquidation. Within a year, the property is sold to a developer who intends to demolish the house and subdivide the land for modern housing. Historic photographs from this period, preserved by the Preservation Society of Newport County, show the gardens in a transitional state, still recognizable, the basic structure intact, but showing clear signs of neglect. The annual flowers have not been replaced, leaving beds bare or weedy. Fountains sit dry. Gravel paths show grass growing through. The boxwood, which requires regular trimming to maintain its geometric precision, has begun to blur and spread. Only the dramatic intervention of the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1962, they purchased the property for $366,000, a fraction of what the house had cost to build, saves both house and gardens from destruction. But even preservation brings its own transformations. The gardens can be maintained, yes, but not at the level they were maintained when the Berwins employed 40 servants. The Preservation Society, managing multiple properties on limited budgets, must make choices about where to focus resources. By contrast, Wyncliffe has no such rescue. Historic American Building Survey documentation from the late 20th century shows walls open to the sky, Gothic windows empty, porches collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow and rain. What had been lawns and gardens has been swallowed by trees and scrub. The terraces that once offered carefully framed views of the Hudson are buried under years of leaf fall and emergent forest. Aerial photographs show the house as a gray ruin surrounded by green, the landscape having reclaimed what had been temporarily stolen from it. Its reduction from 80 acres to a few overgrown parcels held by various owners mirrors the dwindling reach of the family name. Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones's descendants have scattered, the family fortune that supported Wyncliffe long since dispersed. The house itself becomes notorious as one of America's most romantic ruins, visited by photographers and urban explorers, celebrated on websites devoted to abandoned architecture. But the gardens, the terraces, the paths, the carefully planted specimens have vanished entirely, legible only in old descriptions and survey maps. Society columns that once recorded garden parties at Wyncliffe and the Elms, that published glowing descriptions of borders and terraces, now report auctions and real estate notices. The transition from social news to business news marks a fundamental shift in how these properties are understood, no longer as homes or as stages for social performance, but as assets to be liquidated, as real estate to be developed, as history to be preserved or allowed to decay. For the women who grew up in these landscapes, now elderly, if still living, reading such notices is a kind of witnessing, the public confirmation that the spaces that trained them, that shaped their understanding of beauty and order and social position, are no longer theirs, no longer functioning as they were designed to function. The gardens that taught them how to be ladies have become museums or ruins, preserved as artifacts of a vanished world, or simply abandoned to nature's reclamation. Some respond by insisting nothing has really changed, by maintaining their own smaller gardens with fierce dedication, by continuing to speak as though the old standards still apply. Others adapt, finding new purposes, supporting garden preservation as donors or board members, writing memoirs that attempt to explain their world to younger generations who cannot imagine living that way, and some simply fall silent, unable to bridge the gap between the world they were trained for and the world that actually exists. When a garden's last appearance in print is a sale listing rather than a society column, its social function has ended, but its emotional debris remains. The women who learned to arrange flowers on its terraces, who walked its paths while memorizing the names of plants in Latin, who understood its every detail as part of their identity, these women must somehow accommodate the knowledge that the places that made them are now either museums or ruins, either frozen in time or erased entirely. By the 1990s, two parallel stories unfold across the landscape of former Gilded Age estates. On one track, careful restoration. On the other, continued decay. Both trajectories offer lessons about how we remember, what we choose to preserve, and what we allow to vanish. At the Elms, landscape historians and gardeners work from early photographs, postcards, and surviving plans to restore the sunken garden and parterres, returning them as closely as possible to their appearance in the early 1900s. The project is painstaking. Historians must determine which plants were actually used, not just general types but specific cultivars, some of which are no longer commercially available. They must understand the original maintenance regimes, how often beds were replanted, what fertilizers were used, how the intricate timing of bloom was orchestrated to ensure the gardens looked perfect throughout the summer season. Contemporary landscape architects consult with historians to balance authenticity with practical reality. The Berwins employed a dozen gardeners working full-time on the grounds. The Preservation Society cannot afford such staffing. Compromises must be made, using more drought-tolerant plants to reduce watering costs, selecting cultivars that require less deadheading, simplifying some of the intricate bedding schemes that require daily maintenance. The result is recognizable as a restoration of the original gardens, but not an exact replica. It cannot be, given the changed economic and social context. Tour narratives developed for visitors emphasize multiple stories: the Berwins as hosts and collectors, the servants whose labor made the estate function, and the hidden infrastructure of coal wealth that funded everything. The gardens become educational landscapes, spaces where visitors can learn not just about horticulture, but about class, labor, display, and the economies that sustained Gilded Age excess. What was designed to be private becomes public. What was designed to exclude becomes accessible to anyone with the price of admission. At the Chimneys in Manchester by the Sea, new owners in the late 20th century painstakingly revived the Olmsted Brothers terrace design, again using archival plans and photographs held at the National Park Service's Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. The project represents not just preservation but active revival, taking gardens that had been simplified or allowed to decline and returning them to historical form. The owners, passionate about both history and horticulture, commit significant personal resources to the restoration, hiring expert gardeners and landscape historians to guide the work. The restored gardens at the Chimneys function differently than they did in 1913. They are still private, but occasionally open for garden tours that benefit horticultural and historical societies. They appear in contemporary garden books and magazines as examples of successful historic landscape restoration. The owners speak at conferences about the process, sharing both technical details and philosophical insights about why such restoration matters and what it means to maintain continuity with the past. In both places, the Elms and the Chimneys, gardens once run as private stages for a few women become something else entirely. They are still beautiful, perhaps more reliably so than when maintenance standards fluctuated with family fortunes. But they are no longer private in the same way, no longer serving the same social functions, no longer sites of the intimate negotiations and displays of power that characterized their original purpose. Meanwhile, Linwood Hall's grounds remain largely overgrown, visible mainly from aerial photographs and from the street through overgrown gates. The famous French gardens designed by Jacques Grébert are legible in their basic structure. One can see where the parterres were, where the water features ran, but the details have vanished. Trees grow in fountain basins. Paths are buried under leaves. The statue is stained and damaged, some pieces stolen over the decades by vandals. The house itself, a vast limestone palace, stands empty, deteriorating despite sporadic preservation efforts. The family who owns it lacks resources to maintain it. The preservation community debates whether it can be saved or whether it represents an unsustainable white elephant. The gardens, which would cost millions to restore, are not even seriously discussed. They have passed beyond the point where restoration is feasible, existing now primarily as ghosts, visible in old photographs, describable from written accounts, but no longer present as living landscapes. Some Edens are replanted as lessons, others are left as warnings. Both outcomes rewrite what it means to walk where heiresses once arranged flowers in silence. The restored gardens testify to the possibility of preservation, to the idea that beauty and history can be maintained across generations if sufficient will and resources exist. The ruined gardens testify to ephemerality, to the reality that most of what previous generations built does not survive, that decay is more common than preservation, that the default state is loss. In the early 21st century, on a June afternoon that might have come from any decade, a visitor stands in the sunken garden at the Elms, listening to the distant hum of Newport traffic. The sound is anachronistic. In the garden's original era, one would have heard carriage wheels on gravel, perhaps voices from the tennis court, but the view itself has been carefully returned to its historical appearance. The lawn is clipped to pudding green perfection, the boxwood tight and geometric, the marble pavilions restored and gleaming. A guide gestures toward a display of historic materials protected under glass. Photographs, postcards, excerpts from garden journals. Among them is a postcard whose caption reads simply, "Tea House and Garden, Residence of E. J. Berwin, Newport, R.I." The image is faded, colors shifted by a century of light exposure, but the composition is instantly recognizable. The same pavilion, the same layout, the same carefully orchestrated view down the terrace toward the distant trees. The guide explains, "What you're seeing today is a restoration, not the original garden. The plants have been replaced many times, but we've worked hard to make it look as it did in photographs from 1910 to 1920. The Berwins employed about 12 full-time gardeners just for these grounds. Today, we manage with 3 full-time staff and seasonal help, different plants, different methods, but we hope for the same overall effect." A visitor asks, "What happened to all the gardeners when the family left?" The guide pauses, choosing words carefully. "Most found other work, of course. Some stayed in Newport, working for other estates as long as those were maintained. Others left the area entirely. The records don't tell us much about them as individuals. Their names appear on payroll sheets, but rarely anywhere else. That's one of the things we try to address in our interpretation now, acknowledging the labor that was essential but largely invisible." Elsewhere, in an archival repository at Smithsonian Gardens in Washington, D.C., the Garden Journal of the Chimneys lies in a climate-controlled storage box, its pages brittle but preserved. A researcher turns the pages carefully, wearing cotton gloves, photographing entries for a database. The handwriting is elegant, precise, likely that of the head gardener or possibly one of the Lane daughters assigned to record keeping. May 15, 1904. Roses moved to south border. The weather is fine, beds prepared for summer annuals. Between 2 leaves of the journal, placed there perhaps deliberately or perhaps by accident over a century ago, lies a single pressed petal. It is darkened to brown, its original color unknowable. The petal is brittle, fragmentary. Parts have crumbled away, but its shape remains recognizable, a rose, most likely. Someone on a day in the early 1900s cut a flower from one of the terrace gardens, brought it inside, and placed it between the journal's pages. Why? To mark a date? To preserve a moment? To remember something that seemed worth remembering? The researcher photographs the petal, notes its presence in the database, and carefully closes the journal. The petal will remain where it has been for over a century, preserved not through any special technique, but simply through its protection from light and air, its enclosure in the journal's pages. It is simultaneously an artifact and a metaphor, the remnant of a flower once cut from a terrace, placed in a drawing-room bowl perhaps, admired for a few days, then pressed and forgotten. It survived not because anyone particularly valued it, but because it was protected by accident. The gesture repeats across time and space. A woman's hand reaching out to arrange flowers, first as duty, learning which blooms to select, how to cut stems, how to compose aesthetically pleasing arrangements. Then as strategy, choosing flowers that coordinate with decor, that send appropriate messages to guests, that demonstrate one's good taste and management skills. Finally, as memory, continuing to arrange flowers even when the social context that gave the practice meaning has vanished. Performing the ritual because it is what one knows, what one was taught, what connects one to a past that increasingly seems unreal. No inscription explains what was lost when the gardeners were dismissed and the terraces cracked. There are no memoirs from the gardeners themselves, no letters describing their displacement, no accounts of how it felt to walk away from gardens they had tended for decades. There are only the physical traces, restored parterres under soft afternoon light, historical photographs showing the same views in different eras, and in a closed folder in a Washington archive, the flattened ghost of a bloom from a garden someone once let die. The visitor at the Elms walks the paths, pausing at the same viewpoints that Julia Berwin paused at, looking at the same vistas that were photographed a century ago. Everything is familiar, and nothing is the same. The gardens exist, yes, but their meaning has fundamentally changed. They are no longer private domains, but public parks. No longer stages for social competition, but classrooms for historical education. No longer sites of privilege, but museums of privilege. The flowers still bloom each summer, carefully selected and planted by skilled gardeners. But they bloom now for different reasons, toward different purposes, witnessed by different eyes. The gesture of arranging them continues, but its significance has been transformed. What was once power has become performance, not social performance, but historical performance, the acting out of a script written long ago for an audience that no longer exists in the form it once did.